The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us. If you're new to our podcast, I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host, Beth.
Hello, everyone.
And before we get into tonight's topics, we'd like to take a moment out and thank those of you that have purchased stuff from our TeePublic store. It's greatly appreciated. So, if you haven't had the time, go check it out. There's all kinds of good stuff there. You can find the link in our show notes or on our website, whereourmindswander.com.
And if you haven't checked out our premium bonus episodes, we'd love for all of you to give them a look, too. They're just $3 an episode.
That they are, and we wanted to make it super affordable for everyone. Also, Beth and I were just talking about how cool it is to see all the new Wanderers following our Facebook page.
Yeah, we have some really supportive followers who have been with us since the very beginning, and I want to give a shout out to them. I hope they don't mind me saying their names.
Oh, you're going to anyway. Right?
Well, yeah. Marie, Jessica, Kimberly, and Sheila, we always appreciate your likes and comments.
That we do. And we're always excited to have new Wanderers join us also.
Definitely.
All right, that's it for tonight's housekeeping. Let's see where Beth's mind wandered for this episode.
All right, it's a good one. Are you ready?
Oh, I'm always ready.
Native New Yorker Bridget Bonnie Vance fell in love with the home the first time she saw it, climbing through a window to explore its long-vacated halls. She joined a network of volunteers as a curator, vowing to restore it to its former glory. She and her partner, Dudley Stewart, have put in countless hours, along with many other volunteers, to do just that. In the Great Room, they painstakingly recreated the Gothic fan-vaulted ceiling, which resembles an upside-down egg carton. But the home boasted far more architectural wonders than that. In fact, several of the ceilings are vaulted with ornate patterns. One even looks like inverted wedding cake toppers. Like, I honestly don't know how else to describe it. It's these circular horn shapes of pristine white plaster that just protrude down from the ceiling, and they have patterns all over them. And I'm making them sound weird, but they're not. They're really, really pretty. There's also another ceiling that was stenciled by William Morris in the 1890s. 25 years later, after climbing through that window, Bonnie and her crew are still working on renovations because it's a pretty big house. And Bonnie had quite a scare there. One day, she couldn't find her 3-year-old grandson. Terrified that he had possibly fallen down the grand staircase, she rushed to find him. He was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, happy as could be. A girl and a boy had looked after him, he said, as he came down the stairs. They made sure he was safe.
Uh-oh, just let me interrupt you right there. Let me guess. There were no other children in the home.
Bingo!
I nailed it. I knew it.
So I should probably mention that this home isn't just any home. It's actually a castle in Ireland. And it's haunted, to the point that it's on pretty much every list of haunted Irish castles.
Now that I think about it, I don't know how we've gone this long without talking about a haunted Irish castle. You'd think we would have covered one before.
I know, but here we are, better late than never, talking about Charleville Castle in County Offaly, Ireland.
I'm ready for the trip.
The land on which Charleville Castle sits was once a Druid monastic site in the 6th century. They used the land for their religious practices and for hunting. which helps explain an unnerving encounter Bonnie's mother had while staying there. She had decided to spend the night in the tower, and she claimed that she was awoken in the middle of the night. When she opened her eyes, she was certain that a group of monks in red robes stood in a circle around her bedside. They seemed to be uttering a blessing before they just faded away. The castle itself, in the grand scheme of things, isn't all that old, at least not when you compare it to others in Ireland. Construction on it didn't begin until 1798, although Thomas More had built a smaller manor house on the property 150 years earlier. The area had seen plenty of history by that time, for sure. According to the Charleville Castle website, in 1577, Queen Elizabeth I gave 1,700 acres of land to the More family, which, although it once belonged to the Druids, it was mostly an ancient oak forest. The head of the More family was given the title of Earl, but that title lapsed in 1764 due to a lack of male heirs. Even though the earldom no longer existed, the land was eventually inherited by a grandnephew, Charles William Bury. He was 6 months old. On his 21st birthday celebration, a hot air balloon was sent up, but it crashed into the village of Tullamore and completely destroyed the thatched roof town.
That's one hell of a birthday celebration.
Yeah, not the kind you want to have.
Not at all.
He did pay to have it all rebuilt, though.
Well, he should have.
Charles was extremely wealthy, and he was awarded the title of Baron in 1797. Construction on the neo-Gothic-style Charleville Castle began in 1798. It took 14 years to build. At its heyday, the estate spanned 24,000 acres. But the castle itself was built directly over a ley line, which people speculate could also contribute to the paranormal activity there. In 1806, the family was reinstated as an earldom. Charles William Bury became the second Earl. Sometime during this period, world traveler and romantic poet Lord Byron paid several visits to Charleville Castle. It's said that he stayed there every time he visited Ireland, actually, because he was partial to the eccentricities of the owner. Lord Byron apparently threw quite a few parties when he holed up there. He passed away at age 36 in 1824, so his visits would fit in right around this time. And I can see him being completely intrigued by the king oak. So, in the castle's garden, there's an old oak tree that is supposedly 900 years old. The legend surrounding the tree was that every time a branch broke off or fell off, a More family member would die. So I could totally see Lord Byron totally believing that the tree was somehow tied to Druid rituals and that it might have some otherworldly power to do harm.
Can you imagine being out on the lawn and seeing a limb fall off this tree and then you're thinking, uh-oh, who's going to be next? Is it me? Is it one of my loved ones? That's got to suck.
It really does. Every time there's a storm, you want to go throw a sheet around it.
Yeah.
Now, the More Bury family did what a lot of families did. They named each new generation of male children the same name. In this case, there were 5 or 6 descendants in a row named Charles. So it was a little confusing for my little brain, but...
Yeah, that's it gets hard.
It does.
That's the only thing about back then.
And their first name is Charles, but then they have 4 middle names.
Right.
So then trying to figure out which one they're talking about was a little much for me, but I think I did it.
It's confusing as all hell.
From 1822 to 1859, Charles, the 3rd Earl of Charleville, experienced a terrible tragedy. On April 3, 1861, his 8-year-old daughter Harriet was in the library, playing with her younger siblings John and Emily. The governess sent Harriet up to the top floor nursery to wash her hands. On her way back downstairs, Harriet decided to slide down the banister, as every kid has probably done. While she was sliding, she lost her balance and fell to the floor below, breaking her neck. Visitors to the castle, especially overnight guests, have heard strange singing in the middle of the night. They've also heard a little girl's laughter that has no explanation, and at times screams. They also report strange, isolated cold spots on the stairs. Her apparition has been caught on camera quite a few times, although these mists and shadows could be light anomalies. But still other visitors have described seeing Harriet's apparition in real time. They describe her as wearing a blue and white dress, and she wears blue ribbons in her golden blonde hair. But people don't always see Harriet by herself. She's often accompanied by a little boy, too. Harriet's Uncle Henry died at age 7 of influenza. Although he passed away in London, he was brought home to Charleville and buried in the family vault. Maybe those are the two children curator Bonnie Vance's grandson described when he said the two children took care of him and helped him make it safely down the stairs. But volunteers at the castle refer to them as the terrible twins because they are often mischievous. They allegedly locked the young daughter of a resident, prior to Bonnie, in a playroom closet once. But I get the impression that the nickname is said lovingly and not with malice.
I don't know. When I hear terrible twins, I think of The Shining.
I know. I did too. The earldom lapsed again in 1885, again due to a lack of male heirs, and the estate was passed to Lady Emily Howard Bury, a niece. Emily's son, Charles Kenneth Howard Bury, was a pretty noteworthy guy. He escaped twice from POW camps during World War I. He became an explorer, linguist, and amateur botanist, and he went on George Mallory's expedition to climb Mount Everest in 1920 to 1921. Charles himself didn't actually climb the mountain, but he did have a plant named after him.
They named a plant after him?
A plant. Well, he was an amateur botanist.
Right.
So it was some plant that they found on the expedition.
Oh, that makes sense.
Maybe as a consolation prize that he
you
didn't
couldn't
actually
climb the mountain, but we'll name a plant after you. Well, it's something.
When Lady Emily passed away in 1931, Charles inherited Charleville Castle, but he ran it with a minimal staff because he preferred to live at another home in North Africa. When Charles passed away at age 82 in 1963, family members had the roof of the castle dismantled in order to avoid property taxes, which had to be astronomical, and the castle was deemed a ruin. But here's the interesting part. Remember that king oak, that 900-year-old tree? Well, in 1963, the tree was nearly split in half by lightning. Soon after, Charles passed away. But he wasn't the only one. The tree had been struck by lightning before, around Halloween, when the first Earl was still alive. Allegedly, on October 31st, servants entered the dining room and came upon the first Earl asleep in his soup. It wasn't until they approached him that they realized he had died at the dining room table.
Oh, that's a hell of a way to go. But if a limb falling off the tree was enough to take out one person, you think lightning hitting the tree would pretty much take out the whole family.
Well, I'm wondering if when the lightning hit the tree, it took him out instantaneously, and that's why he
Fell
died
over in his soup?
in his soup. What amuses me about that, too, is how the servants thought that maybe he was sleeping. Like, who sleeps with their head in their soup?
I don't know. I've seen the cat fall asleep with its face in the food dish.
Well, that's true.
But
Yeah.
that's a cat.
Today, Charleville Castle is owned by the Charleville Castle Heritage Trust, a nonprofit organization that was created in 1994. The daily running of the castle is done entirely by volunteers who come from all over the world. Bridget Bonnie Vance was one of those volunteers. In order to stay overnight in the castle, you have to be one of the volunteers, and you have to have approval from the Board of Trustees and the duty officer. And you have to follow the rules of the night watch. But the volunteers who have stayed have some interesting stories to tell. After a party one night, one of Bonnie Vance's friends went to bed in a guest room. Except he couldn't fall asleep because two men were having a very loud discussion outside his bedroom door. He could still hear them as he switched on the light and opened the door to ask them to quiet down. But as soon as he peered out into the hallway, the voices stopped and the hallway was completely empty.
That's creepy.
Other volunteers have claimed to see a white mist that appears in various rooms with no explanation before dissipating. Some even report seeing the apparition of a, quote, creepy-looking man. Whether you believe in these claims or not, I think it says something that one gallery within the castle is permanently closed, not because it needs repair or it's under renovation, but because the volunteers there believe very strongly that a malevolent spirit haunts its interior. They say he will attempt to harm visitors that he perceives as trespassers, and rather than taking the risk of someone getting hurt, they just sealed off the gallery from all visitors.
I'd wait till no one's looking and I'd sneak in there and see for myself. I'd hide in there a couple hours with my EVP recorder.
I know you would, and then we would get banned, and we wouldn't be able to go back to Ireland.
Well, we could go back to Ireland. We just wouldn't be able to go back to that certain castle.
Well, I'm sure you do something somewhere else that would get us banned from all the places.
Well, then don't have silly rules.
The night watch would come after you. That's just so cool that they have a night watch. It sounds so mysterious and important.
That's a couple old security guards walking the halls.
I know. Hey, did you know? I don't think it would surprise anyone that bread has been consumed by humans for a very, very long time. But what about other stuff we love to eat? Noodles have been on the dinner table for a whopping 4,000 years. For dessert, you could indulge in something a little younger. Cheesecake was first eaten 2,000 years ago. Pot pie and popcorn went into the first people's stomachs 3,700 and 4,000 years ago, respectively. But butter has them all beat at 5,000 years. Pancakes, shockingly, have been on the menu for 5,200 years. So then, what about bread? How long has it been around? Bread has been consumed by people for 14,000 years. Who'd have thunk it? So what are you talking about tonight, my dear?
Well, I guess I'm going to continue on with our haunted theme. Tonight, I'm talking about a haunted tunnel.
Oh, very cool.
Construction of the Hoosac Tunnel in North Adams, Massachusetts began in 1851. With a budget of $2 million, it was meant to connect the New England business magnates with the West. All they had to do was tunnel through part of the Hoosac Range, an offshoot of the Green Mountains. Initially, back in 1819, a canal had been proposed to connect Boston to upstate New York, using the Deerfield and Hoosac rivers. But that idea had been shot down, and the tunnel won out as the preferred option, at least for some. For others, like future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., it was a preposterous and costly idea. He said that he'd like to, quote, wall up a dozen lawyers at one end of the tunnel and put a good fee at the other.
Wow. I guess he didn't like the tunnel, but he disliked lawyers even more.
Well, I hope you're not a lawyer out there, but there's a lot of people that feel that way. Despite some resistance from politicians and locals, the plan was simple. One team would begin at the North Adams side and another on the Florida-Massachusetts side and meet in the middle. It was a straight 4.7-mile stretch. It sounded like an easy enough idea. Such are the plans of mice and men, as they say. The construction actually took 24 years, and it overshot the budget by almost $20 million. Along the way, 200 miners lost their lives by the time it was completed in 1875, which is why the tunnel earned the nickname the Bloody Pit. Now, the nickname seems fitting since the miners armed with only picks and shovels, well, that is until nitroglycerin became horribly involved, worked long, dangerous hours in terrible conditions. Even so, it seemed the project was doomed right from the start. In the summer of 1851, ground was broken on the North Adams side of the mountain. But in 1852, a new boring machine was brought to the Florida side at the planned eastern end. The machine got so stuck in the bedrock that they had to give up and start over in another location. By 1863, the project was suffering from so many starts and stops and financial issues and strife that the state legislature took over the construction. By 1865, a nitroglycerin factory was built close to the Hoosac Tunnel entrance on the western side. Nitroglycerin had only been invented a year before, and few, if any, of the miners had experience dealing with the new explosive. On March 20th of that year, three, quote, experts, Ned Brinkman, Billy Nash, and Ringo Kelly, prepared for a discharge. Before Brinkman and Nash could run for the safety bunker to take cover, Kelly set off the charge. Tons of rock came down onto the two men, burying them completely. And needless to say, both men were killed. Kelly survived, and rumors quickly spread around the work site that Kelly had purposely murdered his coworkers. And then Kelly disappeared.
Ah, suspicious.
The exact amount of time varies, depending on the source, but anywhere from 2 months to a year later, Kelly's body was discovered. He had been strangled and lay in the very spot where Brinkman and Nash had died.
Interesting.
Deputy Sheriff Charles F. Gibson estimated the time of death at between midnight and 3 a.m. However, there were no suspects, and his murder was never solved. Rumors flew again, and they hadn't found a suspect because Nash and Brinkman's ghosts had gotten revenge on Kelly. The miners even began believing that that section of tunnel was cursed, and the men began to avoid it as much as possible. Perhaps Nash and Brinkman were responsible for the eerie voices, moans, and screams the workers had been hearing for months. This was only one of many tragedies that took men's lives at the Bloody Pit. Just after noon on Saturday, October 17, 1867, 13 miners descended 600 feet into the tunnel's central shaft. It was their job to install ventilation into the tunnel. Unfortunately, sitting on top of the shaft was a building that housed all kinds of flammable stuff, like oil lamps, gasoline, and explosives. A spark ignited the materials, and they exploded. The 4 men working inside the building got out as quickly as they could, but there was no time to pull out the other 13 men back up to the surface. The men on the surface tried desperately to extinguish the blaze, but the inferno brought down the entire building. Rigging equipment, mining tools, and debris showered down the central shaft onto the trapped 13 miners.
That's awful.
Thomas Mallory, a fellow miner, volunteered to be lowered into the shaft to rescue any survivors. He made several trips over several days, but not before writing out his own will.
Well, he was no dummy.
At one point, when he was raised to the surface, he was nearly unconscious from lack of oxygen. He muttered that no one could have survived. The water pumps were no longer working, and now the central shaft was filled with water. Some of the trapped miners' bodies floated to the surface, but not all. I'm sure the other miners were psychologically affected by the tragedy. How could they not be? It was a horrible reminder of how dangerous their jobs were.
Right, as if they needed any sort of reminder.
Yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to work in a mine back then. So it was during this time that workmen began to claim that they were seeing a strange fog or mist that seemed to form out of nowhere on the property. Then they saw groups of miners carrying picks and shovels that seemed to be walking within the fog, except it wasn't during shift changes, and they were all silent. Then they just seemed to disappear back into the fog and then the fog would just slowly dissipate. These silent men, who seemed to appear and disappear several times within minutes, left no footprints whatsoever.
That's really eerie.
But from within the flooded shaft itself, workers would hear things. They reported eerie human moaning sounds that had no logical explanation. And it wasn't just the workers. Locals began to talk also about strange shapes walking the grounds and muffled wails they could also hear from the water-filled pit. A year after the accident, they were finally able to get into the central shaft to search for the remaining men's bodies. To their surprise, it appeared that the men had survived for very much longer than they had assumed. There was evidence that they had built a raft so they could float on the floodwaters. All of them died from asphyxiation.
Huh. I wonder how long they really did survive down there afterwards.
I don't know, but it had to be so horrible to be in that position.
It had to be just awful.
By 1868, only 1/3 of the tunnel had been excavated, and frustrated legislators hired a private company to finish the tunnel. Walter and Francis Shanley were two Canadian civil engineers. They were able to push the project forward despite the miners' increasing fear that the tunnel was haunted. And they had good reason. Many of the workers complained constantly about, quote, hearing a man's voice cry out in agony from inside the tunnel. A good number of the miners refused to enter the tunnel after dark. Management tried their best to explain the noises logically. It was nothing more than air traveling through the pipes and the tunnel itself. The men, however, were not convinced.
Well, I'd assume that a good number of these men would know what air sounds like when it's going through pipes and tunnels.
Yeah, they'd be pretty familiar with any sound that was going on in the tunnels. And I would have told management, hey, get down there and see for yourself.
Right.
I guess you couldn't do that back then. In 1868, a Union cavalry officer and engineer named Paul Travers wrote a letter to his sister about his investigation of the Hoosac Tunnel. The Civil War had ended about 4 years earlier, but Travers had heard about the haunted tunnel and decided to investigate because of all the stories the miners were telling about it. In his letter, he wrote that he and one of the managers, a Mr. Dunn, entered the tunnel at exactly 9 p.m. He wrote, quote, we traveled about 2 miles into the shaft and then stopped to listen. As we stood there in the cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I've heard this same sound many times during the war. Yet, when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft except Mr. Dunn and myself. I'll admit, I haven't been this frightened since Shiloh. Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard. End quote. Interestingly, Travers ended his description of the account by wondering if what he heard was the ghost of Nash or Brinkman, not one of the 13 other miners who had perished.
That's interesting.
It's really cool. Nitroglycerin continued to be a dangerous problem. In December of 1870, John Velsor, a relatively new foreman at the factory, was killed when 800 pounds of the stuff erupted. A newspaper account said that Velsor was blown to atoms, which wasn't an overdramatic description. They actually didn't find a single trace of his remains. And the ghost sightings, or at least the audible sounds of men in agony, continued. A Michigan newspaper published an account told by a visiting drilling operations supervisor. The man said, quote, on the night of June 25th, 1872, James McKinistry and I entered the great excavation at precisely 11:30 p.m. We had traveled about 2 full miles into the shaft when we finally halted to rest. Except for the dim, smoky light cast by our lamps, the place was as cold and dark as a tomb. James and I stood there talking for a minute or two, and were just about to turn back when suddenly I heard a strange, mournful sound. It was just as if someone or something was suffering in great pain. The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel from a westerly direction. At first, I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern. Yet, as the light grew closer, it took on a strange blue color and appeared to change shape, almost into the form of a human being without a head. The light seemed to be floating along about a foot or two above the tunnel floor, and the next instant it felt as if the temperature had suddenly dropped and a cold, icy chill ran up and down my spine. The headless form came so close that I could have reached out and touched it, but I was too terrified to move. For what seemed like an eternity, McKinstry and I just stood there, gaping at the headless thing. The blue light remained motionless for a few seconds as if it were actually looking us over, then floated off toward the east end of the shaft and vanished into thin air. End quote.
Wow. So that's two separate accounts by some pretty credible men.
Yeah, that it was. And that had to be scary as hell, too. As I had mentioned before, there were 200 deaths altogether, although I've only talked about 15 of them specifically. All of that must have taken a psychological toll on the other workers. But even people not associated with the tunnel had strange experiences. In 1874, a hunter named Frank Webster vanished near the Hoosac Tunnel. He was found 3 days later in a state of shock. He said strange voices ordered him into the tunnel where ghostly figures wandered around. Without being able to see his phantom attackers, they took his hunting rifle and beat him with it.
Maybe he was ambushed by a bunch of guys doing something illegal that he shouldn't have witnessed.
Well, maybe so, but nevertheless, something took his rifle. Webster did have marks on him consistent with his story, and his rifle was never recovered. So maybe it was ghostly or maybe not. Since the 1870s, the ghostly haunts of the Hoosac Tunnel have not stopped. But they aren't all the beat you with your own rifle kind.
Well, that's good.
Some are known to be quite benevolent, at least according to former railroad employee Joseph Impico. In 1977, Impico gave an interview to the Berkshire Sampler about his 3 separate encounters with at least one of the spirits inside the tunnel. He began working for the Boston and Maine Railroad at the age of 18. One winter, he was inside the Hoosac Tunnel, chipping ice from the tracks. In his peripheral vision, he thought he saw a man carrying a torch pass by and wave to him, but he didn't respond. It was a few moments later when he heard a very distinct voice say, "Run, Joe, run." Suddenly, he heard the unquestionable sound of an oncoming train. He just managed to jump out of the way of number 60 as it barreled down on him. The man with the torch that he had seen was now gone. 6 weeks later, Impico was using a crowbar to free freight cars that were stuck on icy tracks. Again, he heard a voice, only this time it shouted. It called him by name and told him to drop it. Impico dropped the crowbar, just to watch in horror as it was struck by 11,000 volts of electricity from a short-circuited power line. The crowbar flew and smashed into the tunnel wall with the force of the voltage. And then there's Impico's third encounter with the ghostly voice, as he was helping to clear trees from the tunnel's entrance, although this one sounds a little different. Instead of warning him of impending danger, this one actually laughed as an enormous oak tree fell in his direction. Luckily, Impico was able to outrun it as it smashed to the ground. Today, there are also reported strange events in the Hoosac Hotel. This is the nickname the workers gave a small room that was blasted out of the mountain rock beneath the central shaft. It was used as a break room, but it was also allegedly used as a hobo shanty during the years of the Great Depression and contains hobo markings, although that's completely unconfirmed. The Hoosac Hotel allegedly has a creepy vibe, which one would expect from any tiny room that was cut into a mountainside inside a train tunnel, so I'm not sure how much stock I would put into that. Also, I couldn't find any pictures of it online, most likely because the Hoosac Tunnel is still being actively used today, with at least 8 trains running through daily in either direction. Now, let me just say, we don't endorse or encourage anyone going to the tunnel for any reason, especially not to ghost hunt.
Yeah. Doing so sounds very, very unwise.
It would be very unwise, especially since the tunnel was shut down for repairs for 7 weeks in 2020 due to a partial wall collapse. So this is one place that we don't encourage anyone to go there for themselves. So, let's just be content with the numerous tales that actual workers have to tell us.
Yes, and please don't go there.
Well, you can go there, just don't go into the tunnel itself.
Right.
But it'd be really cool to go there with a drone because, I wouldn't advise going into the tunnel itself, but I'd still like to see it from the outside. Go there with a drone and fly it around into the tunnel.
That's a good idea.
It's pretty safe.
I think you could, I don't know if you could do that. You'd probably get in trouble or fined, but it's better than going in there.
You with worried about getting caught. I say you just go there and take your chances.
So now you see, folks, we'd be banned from Ireland and all tunnels involved with the railroad in Massachusetts.
Only if you get caught. You only live once. Well, Beth, I think that about wraps it up for this episode. And we thank all you wanderers for continuing to join us.
Yes, thank you. And as always, you can check out our sources in our show notes if you want to learn more about the topics that we covered.
So with that said, we'll see all of you next week for another episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
Thank you all for your continued support.
See you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.